Добрий
Добрий день.
Добре.
Добрий день.
Доброго вечора.
Доброго вечора.
Вітаю.
Добрий вечір.
Вітаю.
Добрий вечір.
Доброго
Колеги,
вечора.
Вітаємо вас всіх. Вітаємо на нашій зустрічі.
Добрий
І
вечір.
одразу прохаємо вас,
Здравствуйте.
вимикайте мікрофончики ваші. У вас внизу є вибір перекладу або на англійській мові, або на українській мові. Виберіть мову зручну вам. Угу. Да, і сьогодні з нами в гостях буде Роберт Сапольський, який люб'язно відгукнувся для проведення з нами вебінару. Вебінар у нас буде тривати годину, і потім Роберт залишить трохи часу, щоб ви могли зробити, поставити йому питання, які вас цікавлять. Цим вебінаром ми також завдячуємо нашому колезі Олександру Столярчуку. Це була його ідея покликати Роберта. З перекладом нам сьогодні буде допомагати Ірина. І я думаю, що ми будемо вже починати. Передаю слово пану Роберту.
Well, thank you, Vladimir. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me here, wherever here is in this virtual world of ours. Let me just start off by saying it's an extremely odd experience for me to be talking about stress to a group like you, given the luxury and privilege I have here of sitting in my home in California and trying to imagine the challenges all of you have had. It is heartbreaking what has been done to your country. Let me begin with screen share and begin with, let me just shut those off. Play. Okay, starting off with a scenario from, I don't know, 100 million years ago or so. We have a predator. We have a predator. We have a prey species. There's a tremendous difference in size. The prey species on the bottom has clearly done nothing, yet the larger one is intent on predating it. The larger one has somehow decided that this small dinosaur represents an existential challenge to its own existence. In any case, this small dinosaur on the bottom, I think we could be fairly sure, is being intensely stressed. And the thing that is remarkable to me, absolutely remarkable, is that 100 million years ago, with this dinosaur, I've just seen that I am not being able to operate my remote here. Apologies, let me try something here. No, that did not work. Okay, what is remarkable in the circumstance of the small dinosaur being intensely stressed 100 million years ago is that amazingly, remarkably, this dinosaur would be secreting virtually the same molecule as we would be when we are stressed. A glucocorticoid, a corticosteroid, an adrenal steroid hormone, in this case, cortisol. The remarkable thing is this conservation of the stress response. When we are stressed for physical reasons, when we are stressed for psychological reasons, we are activating the exact same stress response as would any other mammal, as would a lizard, as would a reptile, as would a bird, as would a fish, as would a dinosaur from 100 million years ago. It is one of the most ancient pieces of our physiology, and it is one of the most essential. Now, when making sense of human stress, there has always been this dichotomy which makes very little sense in the context of what all of you are experiencing. Okay, so we have here this classic dichotomy. What is stress about? Stress is on the upper left side for 99% of the beasts on this planet, for 99% of history, involves a critical physical challenge. You are running away from a predator, and you will not survive unless you do so successfully. You are a predator who is half starved to death, and you need to chase after that prey, a short-term physical emergency. And what has always been the dichotomy is then you look at us on the lower right and this extraordinary luxury we have to sit there and get stressed about things that no other animal on earth could make any sense of. You are running for your life, a predator is running after you, any such thing, that makes sense to another animal. Sitting stuck in traffic jams, sitting thinking and worrying about the future, sitting thinking about all sorts of abstractions is a way of getting stressed that is unprecedented in the world of other organisms. So the main theme there has always been this dramatic distinction between the human stress response and that of every other organism on Earth, with a very simple reason. If you were going to get stressed like 99% of the beasts on this planet, you had better activate the stress response, or else you have a 30-second life expectancy. But for psychologically, socially stressed humans, sophisticated ones on the lower right, what we see here is if you were chronically activating the stress response, you were doing so for all of the wrong reasons. And the punchline of the entire field is we did not evolve for activating the stress response for purely psychosocial reasons. Now, analyzing the stress response, what it looks like, it makes tremendous sense whether you are that dinosaur running for its life or you are that dinosaur running for a meal. Above all else, 100 million years ago or this morning, for mobilizing the stress response, the first thing you need to do is mobilize energy. You pull energy from your fat cells, from your liver, you dump glucose in the bloodstream, all as part of this strategy to get that energy, get that glucose, get that oxygen to your thigh muscles, whichever muscles are going to save your life. Making
Robert,
perfect sense. Yes.
Robert, excuse me, we don't see your presentation.
Ooh, okay, that's a problem. Let me. How's that? Is that working?
Not. No.
Is that visible?
No, no.
No. Is that?
Not, no.
No. Uh-oh. Let's see, what can we do here?
Ірина, можете трошки голосніше, бо вас не чутно, пишуть в чаті.
You know, so people don't see the slides. Can they see me?
Лекция началась, которую хотела послушать.
Can you press button share screen?
I did. It.
Yes, fine.
Okay, that's visible. Good. Okay, well, starting off again, as I was saying, we have this basic contrast between the way every animal on Earth gets stressed, a physical crisis, a challenge to homeostasis. Homeostasis, homeostatic balance, an optimal body temperature, an optimal pH in your bloodstream, an optimal everything. A stressor is anything that knocks your body out of homeostatic balance. And the stress response is what you do to reestablish homeostasis. Now, If you were a dinosaur, if you were a zebra running away from a lion, if you were a lion running after a zebra, this is all you need to know about the subject. When you get to us, though, stressors can be when your body has been knocked out of homeostatic balance. In addition, a stressor can be when you think you're just about to be knocked out of homeostatic balance. And sometimes it turns out that you are correct, and it could be wonderful having an anticipatory stress response. But if that is not the case, and you were constantly believing a stressor is about to come, and there really is none, you are being neurotic, you are being paranoid, you are being profoundly human. Sit down any other species on Earth and try to explain worrying about global warming, and it's going to have no idea what you're talking about. But we do. And that's the critical point in making sense of stress in us. We turn on the same stress response that is 100 million years old, and we turn it on for purely psychological reasons. And the punchline is, if you do that chronically, you are going to get sick, because the stress response evolved for dealing with 3 minutes of physical crisis. Now, the key feature of the stress response is whether you were the dinosaur running away from the predator or the predator running after the dinosaur, you are turning on the exact same stress response. And these are very different physiological circumstances. Why should you be turning on the same? Because it turns out whether you are the prey, whether you are the predator, whether you were too hot, too cold, whatever, there are similar things you need to do with your body if you are going to survive this crisis. First off, above all else, you need energy. Not energy stored away for some building project next spring, energy right now for your leg muscles that are going to save your life. And you secrete glucocorticoids, you secrete adrenaline, epinephrine, all as part of the strategy. Mobilize energy from storage sites and deliver it to exercising muscle. The next thing you do during stress makes a great deal of sense as well, which is you increase your cardiovascular tone. You want to deliver that oxygen, you want to deliver that glucose as rapidly as possible. Your heart rate increases, your blood pressure goes up, your breathing rate, all as part of the strategy. Get those critical compounds to your muscles in 2 seconds instead of 3, you're that much more likely to survive. Now, the next things that happen during stress make a great deal of sense as well, which is you turn off everything that is not essential to surviving the next 30 minutes. By definition, if you are that predator, you are not sitting there digesting breakfast. Your gut is empty, your stomach is empty. You don't have to worry about digestion. If you are the prey species, you are running for your life, you've got much better things to do with your energy at that point than worry about digesting breakfast if you were trying to avoid being somebody's lunch. You shut down the gastrointestinal tract, the entire digestive system. For example, you give a lecture and you get nervous, you get stressed, your mouth gets dry. You've stopped secreting saliva, the first step in shutting down your entire gastrointestinal system. Next, growth. You were running for your life. This is no time to hit puberty. This is no time to grow antlers. This is no time to build in some sort of long-term building project. With the onset of stress, you stop growth. You stop tissue repair. You shut down everything that is for long-term planning until you are certain that there is a long-term. In addition, you shut down reproductive physiology. If you were a female of every mammal on Earth, if you were chronically stressed, your ovarian cycles will slow down. They will stop altogether. Stress-induced anovulation, stress-induced amenorrhea. If you are a male of virtually any mammal and you were chronically stressed, testosterone levels go down. Erections don't work very well anymore. all of this picture of do these things later if there is a later, this is not essential to survival right now. Finally, with the onset of stress, you enhance your immune defenses. Your immune system is more potent at making antibodies for a while. Your immune system is more reactive in terms of an inflammatory injury. What you see here is all the things you want to be doing precisely with your body if you were being physically stressed. You are mobilizing energy. You are delivering it where it's needed. You are shutting off unessentials. Your body is protecting you from infection. This is a wonderfully adaptive system, again, if you are like a normal animal. And all you need to do is look at some diseases where people are not able to turn on their stress response. One of them is Addison's disease. Another is Shy-Drager syndrome. These are not diseases where you are more at risk for cancer. These are diseases where you go running for the bus one morning and you drop dead there from hypoglycemic shock. So we have this first critical punchline. If you plan to be stressed like a normal animal, you would better turn on the stress response. For most of us, though, what is far more important is the issue of turning on the stress response too often, too long, for purely psychological reasons. So the question becomes, what is it that makes psychological stress stressful? Because you can be going through an enormous physical crisis and you will be secreting glucocorticoids and prolactin and a bunch of other hormones and turning off this part of the brain and turning on the other. Or you could be thinking about some abstraction that makes you stressed and you'd be secreting the exact same hormones. What is it about purely psychological circumstances that makes stress stressful and real enough that your body reacts as much as would this individual's? Okay, what is it that makes psychological stress stressful? And there's a beautiful literature by now, stretching back decades, showing precisely what are the building blocks of psychological stress. First off, what you see is for the same external miserable circumstance, you are more likely to subjectively feel stressed. You are more likely to activate a stress response, and you are more at risk for stress-related disease if you feel like you have no outlets for your frustration. Classic demonstration of this. Take a lab rat, put it in a room, and give it unpredictable shocks now and then. It activates physiological stress response dramatically. Now, instead, put a rat in that room, give it the same shocks, and each time it gets a shock, it could go to a running wheel and run to get out the energy. It could go over to a bar of wood and gnaw on it to release its frustration, and this rat does not have as large of a stress response. Outlets for frustration. If you don't have them available, psychological stress will be far more damaging to you. Next realm, a sense of predictability, a sense of control. If you lack them, psychological circumstances become vastly more stressful. And as shown in classic studies, again, you can take a rat, you could take a monkey, you could take a human volunteer and put them in a room, and every now and then, without any predictability, they get a shock. You activate the stress response. However, if 10 seconds before each shock, a little warning light comes on, you don't get the stress response. You have predictive information. You could plan your coping strategy. And even more importantly, you know if that light has not come on, you're safe. What predictive information does is it allows you to plan a coping response, and then you know when it's over with, you know when you were safe until the next light comes on. Likewise, a sense of control. You take a rat, you take a monkey, you take a human, and they sit there and they have been trained to press a lever. By pressing the lever, they are less likely to get a shock. Today, they're sitting in the room with a lever, but you've disconnected the lever. The lever isn't working in the slightest. They're getting shocks at the same rate, but they think that by pressing the lever, they're decreasing the rate they would have gotten. You've given them a sense of control. And under those circumstances, the individual does not activate the stress response. More psychological variables. For the same external reality, you are far more likely to get stressed and activate a stress response if your perception is that life is getting worse. If you view it as improving, you are protected from stress. And some of my own research with wild baboons showed a perfect example of this, which is you look at a male baboon who is getting into a fight, and if he's getting into a fight with the animal one rank below him in the hierarchy, and that animal is winning, that's terrible news. He's about to drop in the hierarchy. On the other hand, if he is fighting with the guy one step above him in the hierarchy, and he is winning, that's wonderful news. And what you see is for the same physical fighting, for the same injuries, for the same outcome, fighting with somebody who is threatening you from lower in the hierarchy activates a stress response. Fighting with somebody above you in the hierarchy where you are succeeding doesn't activate the stress response. It's not the physical challenge, it's whether it means it's good news or bad news. Finally, whether it is that rat, whether it is that primate, whether it is a human, in a circumstance of unpredictable stress, uncontrollable stress, no outlets, all of that, shock the rat and it goes over to the other side of the cage where there's another rat that it knows and likes, and they sit there and groom each other and they don't have a stress response. Social support, social outlets. So broadly, what is it that makes psychological stress stressful? For the same external reality, you are going to be more stressed if you lack outlets for the frustration caused by the stressor, if you have no sense of control, no sense of predictability, if you interpret life as getting worse, and if you have nobody's shoulder to cry on when things are bad. Now, superficially, what this would suggest is how do you go and build a stress-free life anytime you are frustrated, find a way to get it out of you, get as much predictability as possible, get as much control, get as much social support. A far more nuanced, far more sophisticated literature shows that this is not necessarily the case. Outlets for frustration, that could be very protective, but it could be a disaster if your outlet for frustration is making somebody else 10 times more miserable than you are. One of the great dangers of frustration, of fear, of anxiety is it increases the likelihood of you displacing aggression on somebody who is smaller and somebody who is weaker. And the truly depressing thing is when you have a stressed organism and it is able to attack someone who is smaller and weaker, that protects them from a bad stress response. So the first qualifier here, the first complication is releasing frustration. Don't do it in a way where you are making everybody around you more frustrated. Next variable, predictability. Okay, so we just saw this scenario 10 seconds before each shock, a little warning light comes on. That protects you from the stress response. Now, instead, let's do it where 1 second before each shock, you get a warning light. Doesn't accomplish anything. It doesn't change anything. You don't have enough time to get the psychological advantages of the predictability. Now, instead, before each shock, 1 minute before, give a warning, and you make things worse because the individual has a whole minute to sit there and dread and anticipate, and this is going to be awful and all of that. Predictability only works within a narrow domain. If you don't have enough time to benefit from it, it's no use. If it's coming so far in advance that the anticipation winds up being far worse, you're going to make things worse. It only works in a narrow range. Likewise, a sense of control. What you want to do is in a circumstance where the stressor is mild, the stressor is moderate, what you want to do then is convince the person they had as much of a sense of control as you can do. Because under those conditions, what you're doing is telling them, look how much worse things could have been. Thank God you had some control over the circumstance. You saved the day. Things could have been so much worse. In the case of a terrible stressor, all you want to do is decrease the person's sense of control, because all they're thinking then is how much less stressful things could have been if only it wasn't their fault. They could have controlled it. A sense of control is only protective against mild to moderate stressors. Finally, in terms of social support can be extremely protective. One's loved ones, one's group, one's God, one's any version of support from that, that's wonderful. But at the same time, there are few things as destructive to us as when it turns out someone who you thought was a true, close loved one you could depend upon turns out not to be. So we have these circumstances where psychological stress can be modified by these, but they're subtle concepts with narrow ranges where they work. So now we look at the unique situation that I think everyone in your country is in, which is you're not being stressed by traffic jams. You're not being stressed worrying about global warming. You are being stressed by a horrific combination of psychological stress and physical stressors that would make sense to any dinosaur. Your lives have been threatened. Your home has been destroyed. Your homeland is being threatened with being destroyed. It is a remarkable combination of every aspect of physical and psychological stress. So the question becomes, what happens when that has gone on chronically? And what we see here on the left are all of those great advantages from before. If you were stressed for 3 minutes, if you were stressed for 3 hours. And what we see on the right is what happens if instead you were stressed for 7 months or 7 years in a chronic sort of way. If you constantly mobilize energy for months on end, instead of just for 30 minutes, you are more at risk for a variety of diseases. Insulin-resistant diabetes, adult onset diabetes, you are more likely to deposit fat in your stomach instead of your rear. In the stomach is a version that causes heart disease more readily. If you were running for your life and your blood pressure is very, very elevated, you were not suffering from high blood pressure, you were saving your life. On the other hand, if your blood pressure has been elevated around the clock for months and months and months, you are suffering from stress-induced hypertension, and you are going to damage your blood vessels and cause atherosclerosis and damage your cerebrovascular system and all of that. You are setting yourself up for some of the most common diseases of westernized life. Next, if you turn off digestion for 30 minutes, that's fine. That's not a big deal. If you turn it off chronically, you are more at risk for the very first disease that was associated with stress starting in the 1930s, a stomach ulcer. Everybody learned that stomach ulcers were caused by stress. And then about 20 years ago, there was a revolution in ulcer science. A pair of scientists in Australia discovered that stress is not the cause of ulcers. Ulcers are actually caused by a bacteria called Helicobacter. It gets into your stomach, it generates oxygen radicals, it blows holes in the walls of your stomach. It's a bacterial disease. This was amazing. These guys got the Nobel Prize for this. This was amazing. Everyone said, oh, it's got nothing to do with stress. Just give people antibiotics to get rid of the bacteria in their stomachs. And it turns out it has everything to do with stress, because only 10% of the people who are infected with this bacteria get an ulcer. You have to have the bacterial risk, but you also have to have some psychological stressful risk. The bacteria start the ulcer. What stress does is stop you from repairing the ulcer in your stomach walls. Because as far as your body is concerned, you're running for your life, you're running for your life. Fix your stomach walls tomorrow, don't bother right now. So we see here a classic interaction between an organic, a bacterial cause of disease, and a psychogenic interaction with it. Next, if you were stressed for just 30 minutes and you shut down growth, this is not a big deal. If you do it chronically, you get one of the truly tragic outposts of child psychiatry, a disease of children for reasons, oops, I think somebody has their sound on. You see a disease of children who stop growing for purely psychological reasons, known as psychosocial dwarfism, stress dwarfism. There's no growth hormone in the bloodstream. You give them synthetic growth hormone and it doesn't do anything. The system is completely shut down by the psychological stress. And what people have shown is during periods of war, during periods of civil strife, children get mild versions of stress dwarfism, less calcium is deposited in bones, growth is disrupted. So this is something that has been recognized for half a century. At the reproductive level, if you're running for your life for 30 seconds and you shut down reproduction, this is not a big deal. You can ovulate tomorrow. You can make sperm sometime tonight. You don't need to worry about it right now. But if you do it chronically, as I noted before, in female mammals, cycles will become irregular. They will stop altogether. Erections no longer work in males. This system is extremely vulnerable to chronic stress. Finally, short-term stress, 3 minutes, 30 minutes, as I said, your immune system works better. If you are chronically stressed, your immune system does just the opposite, immune suppression. And this whole relatively new field of psychoneuroimmunology is the study of how psychological states can compromise your immune defenses against infection. So we see here short-term stressors, the stress response saves your life. Chronic ones, it contributes to a huge number of the diseases of Western lifestyle. Now, what I've left out of this whole chart is surprising, given that I am basically a neurobiologist. What's going on in the brain during the short-term adaptation to stress and during the chronic strain? Short-term, get stressed for 3 minutes, 30 minutes. The stress response does wonderful things for your brain. You increase glucose delivery to your brain. You increase the delivery of oxygen. Synapses in your hippocampus involved in forming memories become more excitable. Your sensory system sharpen. You get a tunnel vision there. You get what's called flashbulb memory. You will remember this moment for the rest of your life. All of that is wonderfully adaptive for those 3-minute crises. If you were chronically stressed, though, this begins a whole picture of everything going wrong in your brain. Now, the first thing that spirals out of control is something that was first studied in the 1980s or so. This was some of my work back then of other groups as well. And the first focus was on the hippocampus. Hippocampus, part of the brain that is central to learning and memory. And interestingly, it turns out to be the part of the brain that is most sensitive to glucocorticoid stress hormones, the highest levels of receptors, all of that. And if you were stressed for 3 minutes, it's glucocorticoids working in the hippocampus, which are sharpening your memories, your recall, doing all of those great, wonderful things. If you were chronically stressed, glucocorticoids work in your hippocampus in ways that are disastrous. Your synapses become less excitable. The dendritic connections between neurons atrophy, pull apart. You get chronic inflammation in the hippocampus. Neurons are less able to survive insults. You make fewer new neurons in your adult hippocampus. You will even kill neurons there. And what you see is the overall size of the hippocampus will decrease because individual neurons are shrinking, individual neurons throughout layers of the hippocampus. When do you see this? Individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder, individuals with severe long-term depression, you see atrophy of the hippocampus, and you see problems with the types of learning and memory that require the hippocampus to be functioning properly. And of course, a critical question here becomes, how long-lasting are these changes? And if you have elevated glucocorticoid levels because of something like Cushing's disease, you have a tumor in a number of parts of your body which are producing elevated glucocorticoid levels, the hippocampus gets smaller, you have memory problems, all of that, but they go in and they correct the tumor, and over the next 2 years or so, your hippocampus comes back to normal size. With post-traumatic stress disorder, with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, the best evidence at this point is there's no recovery, because at least the dogma here is nobody is cured of post-traumatic stress disorder. With any luck, they learn how to manage it. They learn how to keep it at bay. So what you see there, and it's the same story with depression, major long-term depression, and you get hippocampal atrophy. Get the depressions under control so that you've done it with psychotherapy, you've done it with medication, you've done it with both. And what the studies so far have shown is the hippocampus does not recover inside. The best evidence at this point suggests that that is permanent. So that is bad news. Interest in the field then switched to the next brain area of interest. And my lab also did some of this work, a part of the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala sits right next door to the hippocampus. And if the hippocampus is learning facts, learning people's names, learning historical information, what the amygdala is good for is learning to be afraid. The amygdala is about fear. It's about anxiety. Some of those fears you don't need to learn about. They are innate. You are afraid of spiders. You are afraid of snakes. You are afraid of things of that sort. But most of the human amygdala is devoted to learning what new things to be afraid of, learning who to be afraid of, learning which groups to be afraid of. So what happens when you were chronically stressed, chronic exposure to glucocorticoids? And the remarkable thing that people started learning in the 1990s was everything that's happening in the hippocampus during chronic stress, the hippocampus functioning worse than usual. In the amygdala works better than it's supposed to. Synapses become more excitable. Neurons expand their networks to form circuits with each other. The overall size of the amygdala increases. People with post-traumatic stress disorder have amygdalas that have expanded in size, that are more reactive. What are we explaining here? We are showing this is the neurobiology of why chronic stress increases anxiety disorders, why chronic stress makes it easier to condition somebody to be afraid of something that they were not afraid of before. It makes it harder for you to unlearn the conditioned fear that you acquired. What you have is a pathology of an amygdala working better than it's supposed to. A really interesting thing. For my world, we're looking at genes and molecular biology. It's totally fascinating that the hormone that decreases synaptic plasticity in the hippocampus, the same hormone with the same receptors, is increasing synaptic plasticity in the amygdala. This is totally cool, interesting stuff. Someday we're going to understand it. from the standpoint of stressed humans, this is the pathway by which chronic stress sets people up for anxiety disorders. Okay, at that point, attention then shifted to another part of the brain, the part using the neurotransmitter dopamine. Dopamine is used in a lot of places in the brain. In this particular one, it's called the Mesolympic dopamine system, projections from some core midbrain regions to the entire emotional part of the brain, the limbic system, onto the cortex as well. So what is dopamine about? Everybody has learned something about dopamine. Dopamine is about pleasure. Dopamine is about reward. All sorts of drugs that make you feel wonderful release dopamine. What everybody learned is dopamine is about pleasure. Wonderful work, predominantly this guy named Wolfram Schultz at Cambridge in the United Kingdom showed even more so than dopamine being about pleasure, dopamine is about the anticipation of pleasure. Dopamine is when you think it may turn out to be wonderful and you're just sitting there anticipating it. Moreover, if you boost up somebody's dopamine at that time, they are willing to work even harder, pressing away on a lever to get that reward. Dopamine is about anticipation. It's about motivation. It's about looking forward to reward. Dopamine is absolutely essential to those features of life. Okay, so what happens with chronic stress? And by now you could probably guess exactly what the answer is going to be there, which is chronic exposure to stress and to glucocorticoids, and you deplete the system of dopamine. The dopamine neurons that make them release less. Many of the target neurons decrease their numbers of dopamine receptors. What if you set up, this is a system in an individual who is less capable of feeling anticipation, of feeling pleasure, of feeling motivation? What do we have? Classic symptom of major depression, anhedonia, hedonism, feeling pleasure, anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure. What we have here is a neurochemical pathway linking chronic stress to major depression. Now, part of this sort of puzzle, the deep puzzle of sort of the neurobiology of depression is you look at somebody's first episode of major depression, and what is very, very typically the case is there was a major stressor beforehand. You push the person into a depressive state. You can state this cognitively. You have taught them to be helpless. You can state this neurochemically. You've depleted this system of dopamine. But in any case, that stressful period ends and the depression goes away and everything returns to normal. A year later, a decade later, another terribly stressful period happens. And once again, the person falls into a depression. And afterward, they will spontaneously recover. And what the clinical profile is somewhere around the fourth or fifth time that you have a stress-induced depression. At that point, the system doesn't recover. At that point, you begin to have cycles of depression forever after. At that point, it becomes an endogenous depression. And this is a major neurobiological puzzle in the field. What is the biology about when you transition the dopamine system being vulnerable to stress to the dopamine system being vulnerable all the time, and you've got some sort of depressive disorder, very likely for the rest of your life? Now, again, what is most relevant here is this part of the brain is teaching us how you go from chronic stress to major depression, one of the most common psychiatric disorders on this planet, and one that I assume is an epidemic in your country in the last 7 months. Now, around the year 2000, people started looking at an additional area of the brain, the frontal cortex, in particular, the prefrontal cortex. Now, I've spent about 40 years of my life studying the hippocampus, and I've concluded I've wasted all those 40 years because I wish I had spent that time studying the frontal cortex instead, because it's so much more interesting than the hippocampus or amygdala or dopamine system. What is the prefrontal cortex about? We have more of it than any other species on Earth. It has evolved the most recently in us. It's the last part of our brain to fully mature. What is the prefrontal cortex about? It makes you do the hard thing when that's the right thing to do. Self-control, long-term planning, gratification postponement, impulse control. If you were sitting there and you were being tempted to do something violent, or you were being tempted to tell somebody, actually, the dinner you made tastes awful, it tastes terrible. And if instead you say, oh my God, that was delicious, please, I must have the recipe, that's a sign that your frontal cortex was working properly. It was keeping you from doing the easier thing that would be a disaster. Prefrontal cortex about emotional regulation, impulse control, and it is fantastically important in how well it grows into doing those tasks. Here's a finding that is like astonishing. It is outrageous. And when you think about the nature of the world, in United States populations, you look at adults, and depending on their wealth, their socioeconomic status, they have higher levels of glucocorticoids if they are poorer. Okay, that's not surprising. But now we look at 5-year-old children. 5-year-old children at the time they are starting school, and if they come from a poor family, they already have higher glucocorticoid levels on the average than kids from richer families. So what's the consequence of that? What's the consequence of chronic elevation of glucocorticoids in the prefrontal cortex? The same thing as in the hippocampus. Synapses become less excitable. They disconnect. The frontal cortex atrophies, it gets smaller. What are we explaining here? This is the neurobiology of why people make terrible decisions when they are under extreme stress. Decisions that seem brilliant at the time. This is why we become impulsive. This is why we lose control of our emotions. This is why we have a lot of trouble regulating ourselves during times of severe stress. Now, what is really disturbing in terms of that finding, which by age 5, poor children already have elevated glucocorticoid levels. By age 5, those same children are already having frontal cortexes that are not quite as developed as in wealthier kids, that are not as quite as electrically excitable when you look in a brain scanner, where they have a frontal cortex that isn't quite as good at getting them to do the hard thing when that's the right thing to do. By age 5 already, your average poor child is already screwed, is already being victimized by the fact that their frontal cortex is not developing as well as children who are much luckier. Now, what is totally outrageous is, so that's what you find with 5-year-olds. And then people looked at 3-year-olds, and already poor kids had higher glucocorticoid levels. And then they looked at 1-month-old children, already higher glucocorticoid levels and less frontal cortical development. And then in a paper from just a few years ago, people have worked out techniques for doing neuroimaging in the fetus. You can't look at brain areas, individual ones, but you could look at overall brain size. And in a fetus, if you were a fetus in the womb of a poor woman, on the average, your brain is already smaller than kids sitting in the wombs of their wealthy mothers. You were still a fetus, and you were paying a price for your bad luck in this regard. Now, the final area, the that people have paid attention to is one that might be the most interesting of all. And it's a part of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex. What is the anterior cingulate about? People used to think they knew. Take somebody, put them in a brain scanner, and poke their finger with a pin. What happens? One part of the brain activates saying, ooh, my finger hurts, and not my toe. Another part of the brain activates and says, ooh, that's a sharp pain. It's not a slow, abrasive one. It tells you the type, all sorts of parts of your brain telling you where it is and what kind it is. What is your anterior cingulate doing? It's activating, telling you if it's making you unhappy or not. If you were in the middle of a wonderful, exciting game of football and you twist your ankle and you don't even notice it, your anterior cingulate doesn't activate. But if you are feeling that pain and processing it, it activates. So look at what else the anterior cingulate does. Now put the person in the brain scanner. Do not poke their finger with a pin. Make them watch their loved one get their finger poked with a pin. And your anterior cingulate activates. What is this about? This is the part of the brain where you feel someone else's pain, where you have empathy, where for a neuron sitting in the anterior cingulate, it cannot tell the difference between whether you are in pain or your loved one is in pain, or a species that you care about is in pain, or an ecosystem that you care about is in pain. The anterior cingulate is about empathy. And thus, what recent work has been showing, I was involved in some of this, a number of groups doing this, showing something absolutely remarkable. What does chronic stress do? The anterior cingulate doesn't work very well anymore. What is that explaining? Why chronic stress disrupts empathy, disrupts your ability to feel somebody else's pain, disrupts your ability to think about anybody except people who look like you and speak like you and pray like you and eat like you and all of that. It makes you very provincial. It makes you very parochial in terms of whose pain you can actually feel. And what we will show, for example, in some studies, these are studies in the United States where we have our enormous problems with racism. You take someone and you put them in a brain scanner and they look at a film clip and they see somebody's hand being poked with a needle. And at the time that the hand is poked, the anterior cingulate activates. Oh, they are feeling the person's pain. And it will activate almost whoever's hand you were looking at. If you stress the person, though, and now they watch this, if the skin they were watching is a different color than their own, if this person is a different race, the anterior cingulate doesn't activate as much. You don't care about that person's pain as much. You only care about those who count as you, and those who count as them, their pain doesn't matter. And what we saw in this particular study is if you take a rat, if you take a human, we took college student volunteers, and you throw in a drug that will block the ability of glucocorticoids to get to the anterior cingulate, individuals become more empathic. Rats are more likely to intervene with another rat that is in pain. Human student volunteers will express more empathy. What is this telling us? What is it that makes it hard for us to feel empathy for the pains of the rest of the world when the rest of the world scares us, when the rest of the world threatens us, when the rest of the world frightens us? So what I think we begin to see here is this 40-year arc from, ooh, what is really bad about chronic stress in your nervous system? Your memory gets bad. You won't be able to get into as good of a university. You won't be able to have an amazing memory when you were playing a trivia game with your family. Damage to the hippocampus. But it was only after that that people began to learn This is the neurobiology of how you go from stress to anxiety disorders, and stress to depression, and stress to problems with impulse control and emotional regulation, and stress with people being disinhibited and aggressive and damaging. And finally, how stress makes people less interested in somebody else's pain, less capable of caring about anybody other than just me and people who count as being like me. And what I think this describes is a picture of why it is during periods of severe stress, what that often does is bring out the worst in us. In the United States, what our major stressor has been for 2.5 years has been COVID, the worst version of it in the world because our government was a disaster under Trump, because this is a country of superstitious, bizarre, hostile people and such. And what we've seen during this time is, yes, this pandemic has brought out incredible heroic behaviors in some people. It has brought out the worst, the most aggressive, the most hostile, the most xenophobic, the most selfish behaviors in huge numbers of people out there. You know, what we read in the news every day is Ukraine going through this disaster, fighting off Russia. People are organized, people are acting as one, all of that. It sounds like this is an example where maybe this horrible, horrible stress is bringing out the best in everyone. If that is the case, that's different from what is most likely to happen to rats and monkeys and your typical humans. So it is a very good thing if that's the response that Ukraine is having to this disaster that has fallen on you. Okay, so let me stop at this point, and I assume there's questions. Let me stop screen share.
Колеги, в кого є питання?
Можна задавати, так?
Так. Мгм.
Dear professor, can you hear me?
Yeah, barely, just a little. Oh, better.
And now I've got plenty of stress, but this is a good one because I'm allowed to ask a humble question to the neurobiological God in the flesh. And I do mean it. I do mean it, sir. Well, thanks a lot for all the science you have already done and for all the science yet to come. Well, and now I have I have a question, this one. Is there any connections researched between, on the one hand, any neurobiological activity, and on the other hand, night dreams activity?
Yeah, nobody understands dreams, and I suspect all of you guys know much more about it than I do. I just know sort of what happens to brain metabolism during sleep. What is the pathway by which trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder can wind up producing nightmares, flashbacks, all of that? I assume there are all sorts of very wise psychological theories about that. Neurobiologically, nobody has any clue whatsoever. Anybody who claims they understand this, they're making it up. The one thing that I find relevant, though, is when you go into slow wave sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, which is when dreaming occurs, all sorts of your brain becomes active. You're having dreams, you're having visual stuff in your dream, all of that. One part of the brain goes completely silent, the frontal cortex. It completely turns off during dream states. And what does that explain? That explains why dreams are dreamlike, why you do ridiculous things you never would in real life. It disinhibits emotions. And I think what you see then is if the strongest emotions in your mind are trauma and fear and heartbreak, that's probably the best biological explanation for why that produces the nightmares of trauma.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Наступне питання ми візьмемо з чату, а потім, Максим, ви будете. Десятки, сотні тисяч українських дітей в останні місяці знаходяться в ситуації хронічного стресу. Якщо порівнювати з дорослими, то чи в довгостроковій перспективі наслідки перебування в хронічному стресі дітей є більш згубними? І як ми можемо зменшити, компенсувати негативні наслідки переживання хронічного стресу для дітей?
It's very difficult, which if I were a parent in Ukraine instead of comfortably so here, that is something that would weigh on me enormously. What you see is childhood is obviously a time of tremendous vulnerability to learning about, is this a benevolent world out there? Is this a menacing one? What sort of world is it out there? What sort of cognitive schema should you form about the nature of the world? And what you see there is lots of stress early in life sets you up for a predisposition towards becoming helpless, feeling hopeless, all of that. What some studies have shown is if you lose a parent to death before you were 10 years old, for the rest of your life, you are more vulnerable to major depression. Because what you learned when that happened is bad things happen out in the world, and a lot of those you have no control over. And what that does is make you begin to think, maybe it's always bad things, and maybe I never have control. So you see that. I think a big piece of that neurobiologically is the fact that, as I mentioned before, the last part of the brain to fully mature is your frontal cortex. The frontal cortex is not fully functioning until you are about 25 years old, which means during that period when trauma is coming in, when crisis, when all of this, you have not much brain function in your frontal cortex, the part of the brain that could say things like, yes, 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 this is awful, but this is not the whole world. Yes, 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 this is awful, but there's other good things in your life. Yes, you failed at this, but those things went well for you. Yes, this person turned out not to love you, but that doesn't mean no one is ever going to love you. That's a frontal cortex that has to tell your emotional parts of the brain, wait, hold on a second here. Yes, yes, this did not turn out well, but this is not the rest of your life. If you were a kid without much of a frontal cortex, it doesn't turn off. The trauma, what you have learned, just continues on and on and on. A great study that shows this. I love this study. In this study, you put somebody in a brain scanner and this experimental design, there's a computer screen and there's 3 X's on the screen. And you're told you are this X and these 2 X's are 2 other people, the rooms on either side. And here's what you could do. You can throw this virtual ball from yourself to this person. And then they can throw it to them and they can throw it to you and you can throw it to them. You can play catch and throw this virtual ball around for a while. But then what the experiment is suddenly the other 2 people stop throwing the ball to you. Suddenly they don't want to be friends with you. Suddenly you're being left out. And what you see is within seconds, the amygdala turns on like crazy. Fear, anxiety, I'm a social outcast, I'm a loser, all of that. And then what you see a few seconds later is the frontal cortex turns on and it turns off the amygdala. The frontal cortex saying, wait a second, this is just a stupid game. What are you getting worked up about? But there's a type of human where you put them in the brain scanner and they get this feeling that they're being left out and the amygdala activates and the amygdala keeps going and it doesn't turn off and it doesn't turn off. Who is this type of human? This is a teenager. Teenagers do not have enough frontal power to shut down the amygdala at that point. That's why what teenagers are all about is, I want to be like everyone else. I want to conform. I want to fit in. I want to be accepted, because the notion of being excluded causes enormous distress and anxiety. And you don't have enough frontal cortex to try to reason with you and say, this is crazy, put this in perspective. So we see on one hand, this picture of stress early in life having lifelong consequences. And people in my business study sometimes the neuromolecular biology of how that occurs, what is called epigenetics, early life experience, changing gene regulation in the brain for the rest of your life. There's even mechanisms by which it could be passed on to your children. So you sit there and say, the first lesson we have here is stress and trauma early in life is going to be a disaster for the rest of your life. At the same time, we have a second very different message, and one that neurobiology has been focusing on tremendously, which is everything about your brain can change in response to experience. When you were 5 years old, when you were 90 years old, everything in between, even including things that people used to think was impossible, that your adult brain could make new neurons in the hippocampus, take a 90-year-old and put them in a more stimulating setting, and their hippocampus will start making new neurons. So the brain can change, the brain can heal, the brain can get better, the brain could do all these things. That's wonderful, that's great news. You put these two pieces together, trauma early in life could last forever, but with the right intervention, the brain could be changed at any time. What do we see in putting these two pieces together? The longer you wait to try to do the intervention, the harder it's going to be to make the changes. In other words, the minute yours becomes a safer world, every effort should be being made to teach children that this really is not the rest of their lives, rather than trying to do that when they're 30 years old. The sooner you intervene, the easier it is to reverse the biology of it.
Максиме, пане Максиме.
Дякую. Я хочу подякувати пану професору за цікаву лекцію та за його книги. Та запитати, якщо ми кажемо про стрес, то на власному досвіді я перебував і перед обстрілами, і зараз знаходжусь у безпечному місці. Наскільки інформаційний стрес має свою специфіку? Тому що ця війна, вона гібридна і має як фізичний вимір, як політичний вимір, так і інформаційний вимір. І інформаційний стрес у цьому сенсі – це досить новий стрес. Що, пане професору, думає щодо інформаційного впливу, інформаційного стресу як знаряддя цієї війни? Дякую.
Well, recall when I was talking about the building blocks of psychological stress, the theme was you want to have a sense of predictability, but only in certain circumstances. You want to have a sense of control, but only in certain circumstances. You want to get predictive information, but only in certain circumstances as well. You do not want to be sat down and told, whoa, here's some predictive information. 5 years, 3 months, and 2 hours from now, an asteroid is going to hit you over the head and kill you. Oh, I feel so great. I've got all this predictive information now. No, all that does is make things worse. Predictive information about terrible news that you could do nothing about, all that does is make things worse. And what you have in your entire nation's life right now is a lack of predictability, which is disastrous, and a lack of control, which is disastrous, because you sit there and maybe you are far from the front and suddenly they put a goddamn missile down on a train station full of civilians. or they put it down in a maternity hospital, and what the lesson is of that over and over is you have no control. You have no predictability. And unless you were running to Poland or something, you have no outlets. It's not likely, but if it does happen, it's a disaster. And this will be, for decades to come, people studying health psychology will be studying the circumstances of your last 7 months and what the consequences of that will be for the next 70 years in terms of that, because, like, as you said, this is every physical, psychological, political, informational. This is as worse of a combination of all of these factors as possible. And it's a disaster that has fallen on all of you. Yes.
Щато наступне. Чи зворотні зміни, які спричинені хронічним стресом, чи повернеться емпатія?
Wait, could I hear that again?
Чи зворотні зміни, які спричинені хронічним стресом, чи повернеться емпатія?
Okay. Well, that's an easy question. One of the amazing things about us is we habituate. We habituate to terrible things. We habituate to good things. Habituating to terrible things is a blessing for us. Habituating to good things is a curse, because what was wonderful and surprising and exciting yesterday, by tomorrow, isn't going to be enough because you've habituated to it. So in the case of habituating to stressful circumstances, traumatic circumstances and such, it does become less stressful after a while because there isn't the unpredictability. It's going to keep being like this. You have a level of control in that you have figured out what tiny areas of control you have, and you have let go to the idea of having control with all these other areas. Yes, we are able to adapt. We are able to adapt in amazing circumstances. People in concentration camps at each step of the process were able to cope in some ways, a subset of individuals. We're incredibly good at doing that. We are very resilient up to a point. And an awful lot of it is how much resiliency you have brought into the circumstance in the first place. If your luck has been terrible, that up until this past February, you have a nervous system that is not going to be as good at coping with what these last 7 months have been like. What you see there is tremendous individual differences. And I think what we see is people can recover, but they are the lucky ones. And not just lucky in terms of what happens afterward, but almost certainly neurobiologically, those are the ones who were the lucky ones for all the time before this disaster started, because they came to it with a brain that was much more resilient.
Пані Катерино?
Hello, it's such an honor to be here and to hear your lecture. So I would like to ask you a question. So I'm a bit worrying. So whether a relation to a stress could reduce consequences of the chronic stress if the person, of the Eastern point of view, look to this all stuff like, oh, it's happened, oh, we could go through it, and so on and so forth. So whether it would have some impact on our neurobiology in a positive way.
Yes, and it would be wonderful if all of us could do that. And I wish I could. I cannot think like the Dalai Lama. I could not get, the ability to realize that you are not more entitled to anything than anyone else. The ability to realize that truly hating someone makes as little sense as hating an earthquake or hating a cancer, because all of us are just the end products of everything that came before. That could be very freeing. But yeah, I think it's not by chance that Buddhist monks spend years and years and years trying to get this mindset of disconnecting themselves from their sense of self and disconnecting themselves from their pains, from their wants, from their whatever's. I was once actually at a conference with a bunch of neuroscientists and a bunch of Buddhist monks who were like amazing meditators. They were like the greatest meditators in the world kind of thing. They were like famous celebrity meditators. And we're all like there for a few days talking and stuff. And we eventually got comfortable enough with the monks to say, so what's the deal? Are you ever sitting there? Do you ever stop meditating because your knees are hurting too much? And the guy said, well, yeah, sometimes I'll stop meditating. It's not because my knees hurt too much. It's because I'm feeling kindness for my knees. He said, whoa, these people are different humans than because you feel empathy for your knees? Yeah, that doesn't come easily. And all of us would benefit from that. I am sufficiently neurotic that it's the last thing on earth I could ever achieve. And to the extent that anyone there can during this period, it can only be to their benefit, psychologically and physiologically as well.
У нас ще є дуже багато питань, час вичерпаний. Пане Роберте, ви ще можете відповісти на декілька питань?
Yes, I would be happy to.
Наступне питання в нас з чату. Чи правильно я зрозуміла, ПТСР та депресія не можуть бути вилікувані? Людина лише може знизити симптоми та навчитися з цими станами справлятися за допомогою якихось механізмів, яких вона опанує.
Well, I'm not a clinician. I know about monkeys and rats and neurons growing in dishes and such. So all of this is said without much expertise. But what's clear is for a subset of lucky individuals, you can recover from depression. Most people recover from their first major depression without another incident for the rest of their lives. Most people who have gotten to the point of cycling depressions are not going to recover. They are going to struggle with it. In sort of the United States psychiatry view, the best type of psychotherapy that works is cognitive behavioral therapy. And I don't know how popular, how common that is in Ukraine. Most people are helped to some extent by medications, but lots and lots of them are not. And lots of the ones who are helped have to stop because of the side effects. And what you see, I think, consistently, though, is a combination of both the psychotherapy and the meds, the medications, work much better than either alone. That seems to be the optimal version. And under those conditions, lucky people can completely recover from their depression. Whether the depression forever after is just below the surface waiting to come out again is another matter. But for a lucky subset of people, it is not a prison sentence for the rest of your life.
Пане Андрію?
Так, дякую. Thank you so much, Professor. It's such an honor to be here with you. So you've answered plenty of the things that I wanted to ask you. So one little thing. We are living in two parallel realities. One is life and other is war. And now it's been called like life-war balance. And you mentioned that it's good to understand what is that control that you can have on some little things. So it gives a little bit of comfort in a way. So I'm aware, okay, this is that spot. And I thought, what would you mentioned medications and psychotherapy, that would help, but we are 400 something people in here. And we are just that little tiny fraction of people who are under constant stress every day in various conditions. And I thought maybe there's a specific way or protocol that you know or you use in your research with, let's say, the rats, that we could lessen the stress or the stress effect, like I don't know, more exercise or something, or the specific meds. Thank you.
Well, again, I'm very good at telling you why things will go badly if you don't stop your stress. I'm not very good at telling how to stop your stress. And that is sort of what my whole life has been built around in many ways. But I think some of the things that have to come through is stress management techniques. You can't wait until your day off from work to do it. You got to do it every day. You can't be on the telephone and someone says, okay, we got to put you on hold for 30 seconds. You say, oh, what a great time to meditate. I'm going to meditate for 29 seconds now. You've got to set out time to do it separately. It's got to be something that breaks the rhythm of what you are doing the rest of the time. And what that usually means is slowing down a lot. It's got to be something you actually like doing. If you take a rat that is stressed and it runs on a running wheel, its blood pressure goes down. Stress hormones go down. If you take a rat and you force it to run on the running wheel, every time this rat is choosing to run, this wheel is forced to do the same. The rat that is choosing to run does much better. The rat that has no control here does much worse. So it's got to be something you actually like doing. Meditation is wonderful. If I meditated 30 minutes a day, I would have a heart attack within a week or so, because that's not who I am. I think the final point there is, do not trust anyone who has said it has been scientifically proven that my brand of stress management works better than all the others. All they are doing is taking your money.
Thank you, sir.
Sure.
Як би ви визначили термін травматичний досвід з точки зору нейробіології? З точки зору нейробіології.
Well, of course, as a neurobiologist, I look at the world just through like one neuron at a time or one brain region at a time. What I think of in terms of it is, you know, the brain is not your liver. The brain is not your pancreas. The brain is not your spleen. The brain, it doesn't store energy very well. It doesn't repair damage very well. A neuron that is damaged cannot divide again. The brain generates a lot of oxygen radicals over time. The picture of the brain is all life does, starting when you're a fetus up until you're age 90, is poke away at your brain, poke away at your neurons with this little bad experience, that little bad one, and all it does is slowly accumulate damage over time. When you study the brain, you think of it as a terribly vulnerable organ, and one that is terribly vulnerable to a concussive head trauma, and is also terribly vulnerable to living a life without feeling any love. And I think it's an amazing part of biology that you have neurons that will die at an earlier age if you feel like, you know, no one has ever loved you. But somehow that gets translated into the neurobiology.
Пане Андрію?
Thank you so much for being here and listen to you. we talk about meditation techniques, and maybe you know more about it, like from neurobiology side, and you told us about the difference between a children's brain and people who after 10 or 25, and is it some scientific research about this meditation techniques? How can they help children, and how they can help people to make stress more or less?
Yep. There's some amazing research with it. I know a man who runs a foundation. He's a psychiatrist. He's also a clergyman, a religious leader. And he runs a foundation that works with children with cancer. And they teach the kids how to meditate, and how to meditate in order to be able to put the pain in a different place. And he publishes papers in journals. He's a psychiatry professor, showing how this can lessen the stress response. Heartbreak, why does this man have this interest? Because 20 years ago, he had a child die of leukemia. But yes, children, you can do that with them, and they are open to new ideas and all of that, and plasticity and such. There's hope for that. Nonetheless, there's only so much that state of mind cannot do miracles. State of mind cannot bring back your home that was destroyed, or your family member who was killed, or finding yourself living now in, Armenia because you're a refugee. There's limits to how much this can do that.
Thank you.
І тоді ще одне питання вже на завершення. Ми так вичерпали багато часу. В Україні більшість людей в хронічному стресі. Що з вашого досвіду найголовніше, щоб боротися з стресом, що рекомендувати людям?
Well, this is where I feel particularly foolish, sitting here 6,000 miles away, and sitting here in luxury, and sitting here in safety and all of that. I'm supposed to be like giving any advice to you people. It's almost offensive for me to do that. All I can say is, stress, a period of extreme stress, is a period where people come together and feel more connectiveness with their values, and more connectiveness with their community and their traditions. And sometimes that could be a wonderful thing. And sometimes that could make you decide it's time to mobilize the troops and invade a neighboring country. An entire nation next door decides that we're all in this together because our traditions, people feeling very connected to each other and people cooperating with each other could be a very wonderful thing, or it could be one of the scariest things on earth. So be on guard. I would say that some of the strongest pulls towards coping responses at this time may be a disaster, because some of the values that all of you bring together may be ones that are terrible and hostile and not healthy ones. Or some of the ways that you all cope is deciding it's the fault of those other people who are weaker than you, or, all these versions of it. That's the challenge of it. If it was very, very clear how to cope in a healthy way, and that was totally different from how to cope in an unhealthy way, that would be easy. The problem here is it's very complicated. What counts as good for you and a lot of other people can be at the cost of someone else. What decreases your pain increases somebody else's. there's not an easy answer because it brings out the best and it brings out the worst in us.
Дякуємо, пане Роберте. Для нас була дуже велика честь присутнім бути на вашому вебінарі. Дякуємо, що ви поділилися вашими знаннями, вашими міркуваннями.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to do this. Again, even though I'm sitting 6,000 miles away, all of this resonates with me. My father came from Moscow. My mother came from Kyiv. All the other relatives came from Minsk and Vilnius and all of that. This is a part of the world that is very meaningful to me, and all I can do is hope that all of you will be able to be less stressed and in peace very soon, and that something happens to stop what they are doing to you. Yeah. Good luck to all of you. My warm wishes and hopes to all of you. Thank you for letting me sort of spend time with you today.
Дякую. Thank you very much.
Very much. Yeah. Thank you so
Thank
much
Thank
for
you
support.
very
Very
much.
much.
Дякую so much.
Дякую.
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 Дуже дякую.
Thank you very much.
Дякую.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much.
Дякую.
Thank you very much.
Robert, we love you.
Дякую. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, have a good evening. I'm going to go have breakfast now.
Thank you.
Bon appetit.
Thanks. Good night.
Thank you very much.
Добре. Бай-бай.
Дякую.
Дякую.
Bye-bye.
Дякую організаторам.
Дякую. Дуже дякую.
Організатори молодці.
Дякую. Дуже дякую.
Дуже дякую. Організаторам і перекладачу.
Дякую. Дякую, Володя.
Дякую.
Дякуємо, Ірині. Дякуємо, колеги, що ви знайшли час, і бережіть себе. Турбуємося
Дякую.
один про одного, так як сказав Роберт. В єдності наша буде сила, в наших цінностях, в нашій спільноті.
Дякую.
І зі святом всіх, зі святом будьмо.
Дякую, до побачення.
Дякую, до побачення.
Володя, рада тебе бачити. Дякую.